Good evening, everybody. Erev Tov. My name is Michael Uyghur. As many of you will probably know, I have a new role in the Jewish community, but I wanted to be quite clear that I'm doing this evening with the Masorti movement as a member of the Masorti movement, and a very proud one as that in my personal capacity, although of course I acknowledge that the personal and professional are never entirely separated. We are really, really delighted and honoured this evening to be joined by the ambassador, the Israeli ambassador to the Court of St. James, Tzipi Hotovely. And I'm really delighted to have you with us, Ambassador. Thank you very much. And also, of course, delighted to have with us Rabbi Jonathan Wittenberg of New North London Synagogue and Senior Rabbi at Masorti Judaism. And thank you very much to Matt Plen, the director, and Martha from the office who have put together this evening. And I can't quite see how many people are with us this evening, but it looks like we've got 150 odd screens, so probably around 200 people and probably more to come in. The format of this evening will be that I have drafted a few questions, just 4 or 5 questions that I'm going to ask to the ambassador and to Rabbi Jonathan, and they'll each answer them briefly, and then maybe there'll be opportunities for a little bit of conversation between the two of them, but I'll keep it informally structured. And then we're going to invite questions from everybody here, from the Masorti synagogues around the country. And I know there are some people from the Masorti movement around the world as well. And what I'd ask you, please, is to put your questions in the chat. They'll be seen by Matt, who will collate them, put them into an order and choose some representative questions. One other comment, I have seen, as I'm sure many of you have, the articles in the press and the statement by Noam. And, you know, we have to respect the rights of people to make those decisions. I acknowledge it. I wish that the Noam movement were here. I would like to hear their views. And it's very important that this is a friendly but honest conversation about the issues that affect us as members of the Masorti movement and issues that affect Israel as represented by her ambassador, Hotovely. So with that in mind, let's be true to our values, to Jewish values, to the liberal values of dialogue, and have a really good conversation. But Ambassador, since you are pretty new to the UK and new to this role, and certainly new to meeting with all of us, why don't you just take a couple of minutes, tell us something about your life, about what led you to become a politician, about what led you to become a diplomat and to take on this new role. And this is your opportunity to introduce yourself to us.
Thank you very much. And I would like also to use this floor before we start, because you mentioned the Noam youth movement. I came here and I want to meet all Jews and all Jewish communities in United Kingdom, because nothing is more important for me as unity in the Jewish people. I found the connection with the Jewish community here as one of the most important things in my role. I'm not seeing myself just as an ambassador, as you said, to Court of St. James, but also ambassador to the Jewish community and to build a bridge between Israel and the Jewish community. And I don't know if you're aware of it, but usually they say I'm the first female ambassador, but I'm also the youngest ambassador. I'm not as young as the Noam youth movement, but I am young. And I would like to outreach to the young generation. So I would like to use this floor and to say, all those youngsters that didn't come tonight, I'm inviting you to my home. I'm inviting you to the ambassador's house when restrictions will allow, because I really want to have a serious dialogue with you. I would like to listen. And I would like you to listen to what I represent as the official representative of Israel. And I think the only way that people can really be together, and, you know, even in a family, people think different things, but we still are a family. So I just want to start with that, because I knew how much stress you had around this event. So I really want to make this clear. My home is open to everyone. The Jewish tent is big for every single Jew. So about my journey, I'll try to do it in 2 minutes. So I was really, I would say, planning a different career. I was planning to be a jurist and a law professor. I had a big passion and love to my studies in law. When I went to university, I studied law and I loved it. It was for me a way to bring justice to the world. And I was planning to be a professor, and my research was about the Israeli Supreme Court. And I thought, this is how I'm going to end up my life, going and teaching all around the world about justice, constitutional rights, and things like that. But as a very famous British said, and the name of this British man is that everyone knows is John Lennon, life is what happens to you when you make other plans. And I made other plans, but eventually life turned out to me to be very surprising and interesting. When I was 26, I started writing, I started like being a columnist in Israel's one of the biggest newspapers. And I had a television show. I was part of a very famous television show in Israel that many high profile journalists joined and represented diversity of Israeli society. And when I was doing my television show, writing my columns to the newspaper, I still didn't think I'm going to have a shift in my career. And one day I got a phone call that changed my life. It was from Netanyahu's office. And the secretary there said, Netanyahu would like to meet you. I met the prime minister that wasn't the prime minister then. He was the head of the opposition. And we started a dialogue about many things that were happening in political life, in some issues that were on the table. It was the Second Lebanon War. And after a while, after a few meetings, actually Netanyahu offered me to join political life. It was before Israeli election and before he became prime minister again. And it was a very strange moment when you need to make this decision, because joining political life is not just another career. It's basically devoting your life to the public of Israel, to the people. And I didn't know how much exciting it will be. And I said yes, because I was young enough to get this decision. My grandfather didn't like it. Till today, he always says, politics is not a profession. Well, at least today that I'm an ambassador, I'm sure he's very proud, because diplomacy is definitely a profession. And I can tell you that I had the most fascinating 11 years. I served 11 years in Israeli parliament. When I stepped into Israeli Knesset, I was the youngest member of parliament then. And during those years, I spent 4 years in the foreign ministry. I love diplomacy. I watched the power of Israel, how Israel changes all the time, and being more and more powerful, not just regional powerful, but just globally. That's the strengths of Israel are what the new economy really needs: technology, innovation, all the things we're so proud of. And I came to Britain after 11 years in Israeli parliament and being a minister, because the prime minister asked me again to do something new to my country. And because the thing that I really want is to help my country to do things that are, I would say, bring my skills to help Israel. I thought it's an opportunity to go to a higher level. Till today, for 11 years, I represented a sector in Israel. I represented a party. In Israel, the word miflaga is from division, pilug. But actually now that I'm representing Israel as an ambassador, I can speak in the name of unity. And I'm very proud that I made this shift in my life. I'm not very happy I came during COVID year. I would love to meet you in person and not by Zoom, but still, I think I made a great decision, and I'm very, very happy to be here with you tonight.
Thank you, Ambassador. I'd also like to ask Rabbi Jonathan to make a couple of opening remarks. Rabbi Jonathan, there's something very special about your relationship personally and professionally with the State of Israel. And I wonder, as a way of introduction to our evening as well, you'd just like to comment on how you would frame that relationship with Israel.
Thank you, and it's good to be with you and in dialogue with you, Ambassador. You said your grandparents didn't think that being a politician was a real career. When I got smicha, my grandmother said, well, let's see what he does when he grows up. And I'm still waiting to find out. But actually, my father's family fled Nazi Germany and found refuge in Jerusalem in 1937. And my father, at the age of 16, effectively found himself the earner for the family. He was in the Haganah during the siege of Jerusalem, responsible for the cooling of the blood banks. And he would tell some very challenging stories about it. His uncle Alfred, who was set to found the Department of Mishpatim, the very place you studied in the Hebrew University, lost his life on the 13th of April, 1948 in the Shayarah. So there's a profound family connection, but there's also a deep personal connection that many of my closest friends, as well as family, are in Israel. And I admire the country for being full of a remarkable range of chesed and bridge building organizations, for being concerned with tikkun olam, with making links between Jews and Arabs, between different faiths, and the striving for peace and for understanding and the courage of heart that I see in that side of the country. I appreciate also your remarks about Noam, whom I deeply respect and whose values I very, very much share, and which is terribly important are heard.
What I'd like to do is we're going to have a couple of questions now and some interchange. Then I'm going to invite people to via Matt to ask questions, and I'm going to come back to one last question to each of you. But what I'd like you to do, and I'm going to start with you, please, Ambassador, first, is when you look back at the last decade, what would you say has been Israel's greatest achievement? And looking forward for the next decade, how would you articulate Israel's greatest challenge?
We need to think about it because so many things happened in the last 10 years. But I would say two things. One, when it comes to achievements, I would like to start with a very, very latest one, the Abraham Accords. We really wrote a glorious chapter in our relations with the Arab world during the last year. But one thing that is important to remember, sometimes we see just the end of the story, the big ceremonies in the White House, the fact that everyone's happy. But you need to remember it was a process. It was an ongoing process. And maybe this is why I think this is an event of a decade, because we've seen through those 10 years, those Arab countries got closer and closer to Israel because they appreciated what Israel represented. And they realized Israel should be an ally, not an enemy. And Israel has so much to offer to its allies, to its friends, to its partners. And I think it shows something about a change of paradigm, about the fact that the Middle East has dramatically changed in the last 10 years. And what brings me to the challenge, I still think the biggest challenge, I would say, maybe 10 years is too far because we need to solve this problem in the coming very soon months even, the Iranian issue. As we speak and as the talks in Vienna go on, we need to remember that the only thing today that is a real existential threat on Israel is the fact there is a country that actually calls to destroy Israel. And we take that very seriously. So I would say the biggest achievement is with the Arab world and the moderate states. And our biggest challenge is with the extremists that are trying to take all our region to the Middle Ages.
Thank you. Rabbi Jonathan, from your perspective as a senior rabbi to the Masorti movement, a senior diaspora leader, when you look at Israel, how would you answer that question? Similar to the ambassador, or would you take a different perspective, both with regards to achievements and challenges?
I think that the ambassador, rightly focuses in your role on the major political and indeed military issues, and the threat from Iran is real enough. And it takes me to 1948, when the existential danger to Israel was so immediate, and yet there was this courage to produce the vision of the Declaration of Independence, opening the country to all its inhabitants. And I have such admiration for that courage. In terms of Israel's achievements, there are so many that I like to think of them. I'm a marathon runner, and my favorite marathon is the Jerusalem Marathon. And I run around the campus on Har HaTzofim and think of the cultural, technological, and learning and medical achievements of Israel and their contribution to the world, and that hive of diverse discourse that Israel, that is so deeply Jewish. I think of that as an enormous achievement. And when I then run down and through Emek Rafaim and past Baka, I think of my friend and colleague Tamar Elad Appelbaum, who created this Yahadut Tzionit Eretz Yisraelit. And when one goes to her services, there are imams, there are priests, there are Haredim, there are Jews not wearing kippot. On Yom Yerushalayim, she understands the Kodesh of the place as not a flag on the Temple Mount, but all the different faiths together. And I think that's the most enormous and courageous achievement that I see. In moral terms, the greatest challenge is the dignity of all the citizens and all the neighbors of the state of Israel. And I've seen that on many different occasions. When I've been out with rabbis for human rights, for example, I watched a house demolition with this huge crane gradually destroying it. And then these children, I think it was in Silwan, they come home from school and they see the family house. Where does that hurt go? And so the challenge of being a country that is able to heal these divisions, that is able to challenge both the racism of others and the racism within itself. That is a profound challenge, a challenge facing the whole of the world, but Israel is our country. And so our heart is part of that challenge.
I'd like to allow each of you to respond to the other, so we have this as a conversation. So Ambassador, is there something that you'd like to respond? And you may not wish to, but if you would like to, I'd like to give the opportunity to respond to what Rabbi Jonathan just referred to.
I just really enjoy listening to the way he describes Jerusalem. Nothing really to make as a comment. I think as the truth is, both of us give different sides of the picture, because Israel has developed so much in the last 10 years. Just picking one thing is not going to reflect the reality.
Thank you. Rabbi Jonathan, anything you want to add, or shall I move on?
I think we'll move on for now. If that's,
sure.
Yeah.
I want to move on to, I believe, will be the meatiest question. Jonathan, I know you're a vegetarian. I'm sorry for that metaphor, but a substantive question. And I'm going to start again with you, Ambassador, please. I know it's very noteworthy that not only are you the very youngest ambassador and a female ambassador, you're also an Orthodox ambassador. Mm-hmm. And you're not the first Orthodox ambassador, but it is a very interesting coalition of ideas that you bring to this very important role. And so I'd like to ask you, what does your Judaism, your personal Judaism, teach you about the role of Israel in the world, and how would you like to see Judaism expressed in the state of Israel? So both an external facing and internal facing question. And I am certainly moving here into a little bit of philosophy, theology, ideology. And I'd like us to have a few minutes looking at this question on that level.
I would like to start actually from the external part, which is easier for me. I was really, really inspired by a very famous British rabbi, Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, Zecher Tzadik Livracha. Rabbi Sacks, for me, for the last few years, was a real inspiration, because the way he was is the way I want Judaism to be. I really would like to see Judaism that speaks up and is relevant. One of the things I grew up on the idea that Israel is not just a regular nation state, because in every single Jew, there is this blessing of Abraham. And I would like to quote the very famous blessing that he got. V'nivrechu b'cha kol mishpachot ha'adama. Rabbi Wittenberg, you can translate me better than I can. But v'nivrechu b'cha kol mishpachot ha'adama means that the Jewish blessing is to bring a blessing to the entire nations around the world, not just, to the state of Israel. And I think this is part of what modern Israel is trying to do. Sometimes with more success, sometimes we need to do more. But basically what we turn out to be is a country that shares the know-how, not just, most of the countries have, I always like to give this example, most of the countries have foreign aid. They just bring money to countries that are weaker. Israel, and I want to mention another very, very impressive woman, Golda Meir was our first female prime minister. When she was a foreign minister, she started Mashav. Mashav is our cooperation part with the third countries around the world and the third world. And she started a major cooperation with Africa. We're a really young country, no resources, but she was thinking, we have a know-how and we want to share it. So I think basically this is how I would like to see Israel. Israel that is a country that gives blessing to the entire world, to the nations, and not a country that is focused only on its internal problems and issues. About what's happening in Israel, there are very, very exciting things that are happening in Israeli Judaism. I think there is a renaissance of Jewish studies. My dream, at least as a woman that was privileged to have many years of Jewish studies, I studied, I think, for over 15 years with different rabbis, with different rabbaniyot. I had very much of female inspiration. I learned in Midrasha. I'm part also of the feminist renaissance in Israel of women studying Torah. So part of my legacy and part of the fact that I'm well educated, not just by going to law school, but also having the Jewish values of making justice, also mishpat ivri, also the Hebrew, I would say, way of making justice. And the way I would like to see Israeli Judaism is that every Jew has access to the great treasures of, or treasure, I should say, of Jewish knowledge, because this is another know-how. This is like a secret key to understanding many spiritual phase and things that is about our role as people. And I really believe that we're going this way. Many people are now curious to, I would say, to find out what's their identity, how they define themselves. I think Israel is going in a very interesting direction by opening the Jewish resources to everyone.
Okay. Rabbi Jonathan, I'd like you also please to reflect on this question, the role of Israel in the world, as your Judaism teaches you, and how you believe, coming from the perspective of a leading Masorti rabbi, how Judaism should be practiced, displayed, thought about within the state of Israel.
It's such a rich question and there's so much to say. And Ambassador, the way you express the dream of Israel as what it can contribute to the world and the rich renaissance of Judaism within it, I deeply agree with all of it. I probably don't agree with the things which you haven't said and which haven't been said, and which some of which I want to raise. From a point of view environment, which I'm deeply involved in, I'm conscious as we approach hosting COP26 in this country, that Israel will have high-tech gifts to offer and share with the rest of the world. And that's something that makes me deeply proud of the contributions of Israel and is part of its Judaism. When I think about it, it seems to me the kind of meta-narrative of Judaism, if you reduce it to a sentence, is Yetziat Mitzrayim. From knowing and experiencing in our own person injustice, we've come to understand the meaning of justice. Justice for all. You spoke very eloquently about justice. Justice for all. And from having known profound indignity, we've come to understand that Tselem Elohim is absolutely central to the understanding of Judaism. So in terms of how Judaism is expressed in Israel, and I think that's the light that shines out of Israel, they're inseparable as well. I would like to see that Judaism really lived. That means a pluralistic Judaism. That means that the doors are equally open for different kinds of Judaism. I think it's a great strength when so many people are alienated in our day, that there's Reform Judaism, there's Masorti Judaism, there's Liberal Judaism, there's Rabbis for Human Rights, there's Haredi Judaism. Shtisel, by the way, has given us a much deeper insight and empathy for Haredi Judaism, but I would like to see that with respect for all our converts, with respect for women at the wall and the equality of place of women. You've talked about your role in women and learning. I'm also very sensitive to issues of Judaism 36 times talks about Vahavtem et Hager. And a place I love in Israel is Kuchinate in South Tel Aviv, which has given a home to Eritrean women, many of whom were raped on their journeys across the Sinai Desert. And there they make these wonderful baskets. It's a creativity that expresses to me the inclusiveness, the welcome of refugees as part of a society, as part of the whole, even though these women are not Jewish. So those are some of the core values in that, having known injustice, we will live justice. And that, to my mind, goes in hand with Judaism, with Israel's democratic nature, in that it welcomes the debate and the discourse, even if it's sometimes uncomfortable, even if it comes sometimes from B'Tselem and breaking the silence, and from the New Israel Fund. I think those voices are extremely important, and the ability to contain them in Judaism's culture of sharp but listening debate. I think that's the glory of Israel, and that will shine out also to the rest of the world.
So, Ambassador, I think it's very appropriate that you're given a chance to respond to some of the things that Rabbi Jonathan said. And I'd like to particularly ask you to focus on the question of the formal status of non-Orthodox Judaism within Israel, which is a matter of great concern to the Masorti movement as well as other non-Orthodox movements, and also the question of the status and the treatment of non-Jews within the state of Israel.
Let's start from the end. Non-Jews Israelis are being treated equally. This is part of our independence declaration. We're very proud of it. This is part of being Jewish. All the minorities in Israel get equal rights, equal position, equal representation in Israeli parliament, Israeli governments. So I would say that this is the easiest question, because Israel was established on the idea of equality, and we do that all the way, no matter who's the government, and we're very happy and proud with our democracy. About Jewish streams, I will call it, we definitely believe that every single Jew, no matter what kind of Judaism he believes and practices, has his home in Israel. And we want all Jews to feel comfortable. We want all Jews to feel that this is their home. And part of what the government was doing in the last few years was to think how to create a really good dialogue between diaspora Jews and Israel about the Kotel issue, about egalitarian prayer. And then we had the Robinson Arch as a place that families from all around the Jewish world can come and pray and be together. I really believe maybe more creative solutions need to be taken. But one of the interesting things I experienced during my conversations here with people, I was with the Reform movement, and one of the people asked me a question about his daughter made Aliyah, and she lives in Israel. And I asked him a very simple question. I asked him, how does she feel as a Reform Jew? And he said, she feels at home. She's Israeli. And I think this is the main thing. Everyone in Israel feels at home. Every Jew feels at home. And when it comes to, I would say, changes in the way the country is, I always remind you the way Britain is. When you ask British Jews, what is the main Judaism here? You say United Synagogue. But I go and meet every single community here, even though United Synagogue is the mainstream in British Jewry. So it's the same in Israel. We really believe that every Jew should feel comfortable and should feel Israel is his home.
From your mouth to God's ears. But I have to say that's not necessarily the experiences that I hear about. There are also streams of Judaism who don't feel at home, who feel precluded, who feel they don't have the same access to government funding, that their converts' marriages are not respected. So I think that's something we'd very much like you to hear and to convey to your government, that this is of great importance to our community. And also that also applies to non-Jews. Indeed, I think, given the history of the Jewish people and the challenges of the region, Israel has got enormous achievements here, but it's also got enormous distance to travel. I had to make a very unusual Nichum Avelim, sadly only phone call, otherwise I would have loved to have been in Israel. It was to the son of an imam in a small village off the Jerusalem highway. I'd sat in his home several times because it's one of the villages in which my good friend Simon Lichman brings together Jewish and Palestinian schools. And this imam is a lovely man, and he's very, very pro-Israel. And he would say, he said to Muslim friends, this is the country where you'll find equality. And then he says, but I never feel equal here. I never really feel it. So from your mouth to God's ears, but I think we want to say to you, there's a journey, a very serious journey to travel. And certainly it matters a lot to diaspora Jews of all the movements to see and to help Israel travel it.
What I'd like to do now, sorry, Ambassador, I don't wish to interrupt you if you wanted to respond.
No, it was mentioning traveling. Are you interested in traveling to Israel? Or
I was thinking of traveling a spiritual and moral journey, but
I'm sorry.
I
was expecting a question about traveling to Israel. I was so focused on passports, green passports. I'm sorry.
The journey towards greater equality for the religious denominations in the law and the culture of equality for Israel's non-Jewish citizens and residents. Well, what I'd like to do now is to open up for questions, and I'm going to ask Matt Plen, the director of Masorti Judaism, to ask the questions. We'll do that for about 20 minutes, and I'm going to come back for a final question to both the ambassador and Rabbi Jonathan. So I'm going to ask both questions and answers to be as brief as possible so we can cover as much material as people would like. Thank you very much. Matt.
Sure, thank you. This is Matt Plen, Chief Executive of Masorti Judaism. I'm staying behind the scenes. My role is just to read out the questions that have come in. We have lots and lots of questions. So apologies to anyone who sent one in and we don't quite get to it, but we do have quite a lot. So we've got lots of interesting and challenging questions for both speakers. Question number one, please can the ambassador and Rabbi Wittenberg speak about how they see the Palestinian problem can be solved?
An easy one. I think that since Israel was established, all our leaders wanted to reach peace with the neighbors. For many years, it looked like it was impossible. And then Menachem Begin came, and in a very, very interesting initiative, he reached out to President Sadat of Egypt, and he called him to come to the Israeli parliament, to the Knesset. And Sadat came and gave a very famous speech. And the very basic message was, no more war, no more bloodshed. And I think this is basically the secret. When every time two people want to get closer and to sign peace agreement, the basic thing behind it should be no more war, no more bloodshed. And I think that this is a key point when we want to have peace with our neighbors, with the Palestinian neighbors. For the last 25 years, Israeli governments from left, from the center, and from the right, with different prime ministers, tried again and again, call the Palestinians to come and negotiate. Two Israeli prime ministers were willing to give up the holy city of Jerusalem and to give Palestinian sovereignty over it. One of them was Ehud Olmert, that confessed in a television interview and said, I gave up on Israeli sovereignty on the Western Wall. And the other one was Ehud Barak, that gave up the hold of Israel again, and he wanted to be as some kind of international, how they call it, like Jerusalem will be international city. So both of those prime ministers came back home with no results. I'm giving those examples in order to explain that in order to have a real breakthrough, you need to have leadership that sits together on a direct negotiation and calls to the children, to the Palestinian children, to stop incite, to stop saying that Jews are monkeys. We can see some anti-Semitism, a very strong anti-Semitism in some of the mosques. You can see that in Palestinian Media Watch. And we can see the textbooks that, again, are calling to destroy Israel. Those kind of things are not promoting peace. And we need to remember that in order to move forward, we need to sit to the same table and have direct talks. And if people want to see, I truly believe that one day we will have the right leadership that will come and say no more war, no more bloodshed. I truly believe, I'm optimistic. I'm looking at the future. I'm saying normalization has happened. The Palestinians can see more and more Arab countries want to be friends with Israel. So it can't be that they will be left out, but it really takes brave, courageous leadership. Israeli leadership was always for peace, always. It was never the issue of Israeli leaders not willing to negotiate or not willing to have peace talks. All Israeli leaders were there. All Israeli leaders were willing to have peace talks. We really need to have this peace agreement. We really need to have a Palestinian leadership that is willing to recognize Israel as a Jewish state, that is willing to sit together and just talk. So if you're asking me about the future, well, you need to encourage the Palestinian leaders to come and sit and talk with the Israelis.
Rabbi Jonathan.
Again, I just look forward to the day when those direct talks really happen, because it's very hard to envisage any other solution than a two-state solution, which gives sovereignty to both nations and clearly defined international borders so that peoples understand, both peoples, Palestinians and Israelis, understand where they are. And you're definitely right in that there have been missed opportunities and thrown away opportunities. And all of us wonder what would have happened had Rabbi not been murdered. And what would have been the consequences then, whether Oslo would have gone through. But there have also been mistakes on both sides. And one of the organizations that has most moved me are the Bereaved Parents Circle, They've been in my home and I know their leaders very well, both the Palestinian and the Jewish leaders, and I've admired their courage. And they say if we can talk to each other, despite the grief in our hearts, despite losing our children or our sisters and brothers, surely our leaders can. And one of their slogans is, don't just be pro-Israeli or don't just be pro-Palestinian. Please pro-human. And during the second Lebanon war, not the second operation against Gaza, I was in Israel and I wanted to talk to wounded Israeli soldiers. So I went to Tel HaShomer hospital and listened to them, and it was very profoundly disturbing. And then I went to a hospital in East Jerusalem and I listened to families who'd been flown there from Gaza and what had happened to them, and that was terrifying. And so I think there needs to be a profound listening by both sides, rooted in civil society, in family life, in education and in schooling, to really hear the story and honor the story of both sides, because it's painful in both directions. And that will build a sense that we have everything to lose and everything to gain, and work up to the leaders coming together. Because there have been missed opportunities, you're definitely right, but I also think we have to say they've been on both sides.
Matt.
The next question actually connects to that. The next question says this: Rabbi Jonathan asked a question about the pain of a Palestinian child coming home from school to see their home destroyed. And the questioner says, I would love the ambassador to share her or her government's belief as to where that pain has gone and continues to go.
I really don't understand the question. There were like 7,000 Israelis that their house was destroyed when Israeli government made the decision about the disengagement. Their house were destroyed, the synagogues were totally destroyed, and people were being bought out of their graves. And this was a thing that Israel did to its citizens in order to promote peace. So you need to have the context of the big story. Israel did so much in order to achieve peace. 7,000 Israelis gave up their homes, destroyed their homes. You need to look on the other side. So every single story about someone that loses the house, you need also to give the context. So this question cannot be understood without the context. The Israeli Supreme Court, time after time, backs up those decisions of Israeli government whenever there is illegal building. And you will have the same in London or in Paris or in New York. So you need to understand whether it was a decision about illegal building or it was a decision that meant to promote peace. You need to see the context.
Can I comment? Is it okay for me to say something? Thank you. I just want to make it also clear that one of the projects our community and movement is involved in is Peace of Mind, in which units of the Israeli army, a few years after their Shehut Chovah, Kravi units who've been in the forefront of the fighting, come and discuss their experiences. And I think I want to very much acknowledge that these are experiences that I haven't had. They're experiences of profound courage, digging deep into people's humanity, and that there's profound suffering on both sides, and people losing family members, beloved family members, and that this must be, in a way, it's the shared hope and the shared pain that must lead to the transformation of a reality in which people lead together. It's on both sides, and I want to make that clear. But I've seen what's happened to some Palestinian homes, and sometimes they cannot get permission to build. But it's definitely, I think we love Israel with an aching heart and with a heart full of hope as well.
Matt, please.
Sure. So we have a few questions on different topics. So one of the questions asks the ambassador to comment on why Israel's educational levels for primary and secondary school students is so underfunded with such poor results compared to other OECD countries. Why is Israel's educational levels for primary and secondary school age students so underfunded with such poor results compared to other OECD countries?
Okay, so let me give you the real answer. Israel is not a country that is educating its kids just in elementary school, in high school. Israel has a spirit, and this spirit brings our economy to be one of the most strongest and the most inspiring in the world. And you wouldn't have had that if you didn't have those students that you're saying they're lower than the OECD. Look at the results of Israel's economy. Come on, be serious. when I went to Japan as a deputy foreign minister, they have a very, very good educational system. They said something amazing, and I learned something from it. They said, what makes Israelis so good in startups, so good in innovation? We as Japanese, we established so many famous technological big firms, but we cannot do startups. And we start discuss the educational system. And then we find out a secret. And they told me the secret. They said, you Israelis are willing to fail. We Japanese are not willing to fail. So you end up with a very good educational systems, but you end up with no internship. I'm sorry, I have difficulties with this word. You need to have people today that will invent solutions. And Israelis today are in the front line of inventing solutions, in the front line of technology. We are a second hub after Silicon Valley in innovation, not Britain, not France, not Germany, it's Israel. And part of it is the great educational system that teaches you to ask questions, to fail, and not to give up, and to try again. So I would like to say that we need to look in a different way on Israel's educational system. And we happen also to have some universities that bring the best research centers in the world, like the Weizmann Institute. And we're very proud of Israel's educational system.
Ambassador, the risk here is that we're now reaping the benefits of the investments in education 20 years ago. From the point of view of the data, the fear is the investments going on now throughout Israel, regular Jewish society, Haredi society, and Arab society, is creating such poor results compared to OECD countries that the future looks quite scary. Someone like Dan Ben David from Tel Aviv University and the Shoresh Institute is very worried about what the next 20 years will bring. And I felt that your answer didn't really cover where the data is now.
First of all, you need to ask me if you want to ask about the Haredi population. I have answers for that. If you want to ask me about the Arab population, I have answers for that. But you didn't target specific sectors. Well, I think the Haredi society in Israel is going through a very, very big reform. And sometimes it's not in the headlines, but I can see it. I was the head of Women's Rights Committee in the Knesset. And one of the amazing things about the ultra-Orthodox group in Israel, more and more women get academic education and go to work, especially in high tech. And this is the future. When women start to be in the front line and when they get education, eventually men will come. I'm very much optimistic about Israel. I want to tell you to whoever thinks the future is not good, I just want to tell you that this is a country, when it was established, no one believed it will manage to succeed even 2 years. Not the British people that left, not even the State Department in America. When we read the way those countries were thinking about Israel, they said it has no chance. So I really think we need to be more optimistic about the ability of Israel to thrive. I think whoever lives in Israel can really see how much this spirit of innovation will never leave us. I believe that the ultra-Orthodox and the Arab communities both are going to be part of it.
Thank you. Matt, please.
So we have another question kind of connected with that, I suppose. As COVID has starkly demonstrated, environmental and biological risks do not respect borders, and one country's environmental crisis can pose an ongoing threat to others. How will the Israeli government evolve its relationship with its near neighbours to promote regional climate change resilience and adaptation as a means of securing Israel's own future?
Do you mean about environmental issues or the pandemic? It's two different issues.
Yeah, the question is about the environmental issues.
Okay, so environmental issues, we have very strong cooperation both with Egypt and Jordan about water solutions. As you know, Israel is a leading power in water solutions because 2/3 of the country is a desert. And since Israel was established, it was a very big thing in Israel to create many water solutions. And we have a lot of cooperation with our neighbors. Both countries are suffering again from problems in the way you manage water. Some countries have, in Egypt, it's also the problem of the Nilus, the river. And we need to, I would say we need to extend cooperation, but it's already there. So one of the things that the peace agreements has brought to Israel and we're speaking about a long time ago, with 40 years of cooperation, is we knew that water is a serious resource that we need to work together in order to make sure that all countries will thrive. But you also need to remember that some of the ability to thrive depends also on the regime and on having free society and free economy. Well, sometimes we cannot export that. So we are cooperating when it comes to resources, and we are sharing our know-how on environmental technologies. This is for sure.
Rabbi Jonathan, an area close to your heart, I know.
It's absolutely close to my heart. And I actually met the leadership of EcoPeace at a conference during London Climate Action Week 2 years ago. And they've been working together, and that's Jordan, Israel, and the Palestinian Authority on the water flow through the River Jordan, and negotiated increased water flow, which is of benefit to all the countries and improves all the Jordan Valley ecosystems, as well as working together on the reflooding of the Hula, which, I've seen the extraordinary bird life there. So I think there's huge opportunities for cooperation there. And I think that is very exciting. The Arava Institute also operates in the south of Israel with cooperation across the borders. And that's absolutely essential. And that's a model for what we have to do between nations in the whole of the world. There's also a very, very interesting project run by the son of a Holocaust survivor who came here as one of the boys, welcomed by Britain in 1945. And that's Arden Holter, to reforest the Galilee ancient oak forests. And he's involved the Hebrew University, both Jewish and Arab villages around the Carmel. And the plan is very significant oak forest reforestation. It's extraordinarily exciting. It's exactly one of the creative ways in which we could build bridges which would speak to our community as well. I also think Israel's commitment to electric vehicles has been ahead of Britain. Britain has now put forward its dates. Energy sources in Israel are a challenge, that the amount coming from renewables is much lower than it could be and should be. And I think there is or needs to be a political will to put that up into the 40–50% within the next few years, rather than just, I think, the single-digit percentages.
Matt, let's take one more question.
Yeah, we have a little bit of time, and there are a couple more. So do you have time for a few more, Michael?
Sure,
okay?
I'm here all night.
The truth is, we have just 5 minutes. We have just 5 minutes left, so maybe just
okay.
One more.
So I think we're going to check. I'm going to push it. We're going to try and do two, if that's okay. So the first one is, can both speakers please respond? Please explain, how do you respond to anti-Zionist Jewish organizations that seem to have proliferated in the last 5 years? And what can we do to make these organizations more Zionistic?
I'll be happy that Rabbi Wittenberg will take this question, because the truth is, I didn't meet those organizations. So
I come across their voices and they really, really trouble me. Because for all the critique that one can have of Israel, there's a profound loyalty there that I experience. I experience it, and I began by saying that my father found refuge there. And I feel that the nature of our politics will differ. We have right wing and left wing in our community, but for me, it is an unquestionable thing that we are jointly, we as Jews in the diaspora share a responsibility, arevim ze lazeh, with the state of Israel. One of the things that alienates so many people is the fact that peace hasn't been found, and the feeling of erosion of democratic values, which is something we urgently want to see Israel respond to. But that should not justify anti-Zionist Jewish organizations who don't want to see Israel thrive. It's one of the reasons I don't sympathize with BDS, and I don't want to be seen in those platforms.
Ambassador, something you'd like to say?
Well, the only thing I can say is Judaism is all about loving Israel, and I really don't understand how you can be anti-Zionist, because we're all Zionists. I don't really believe someone who's Jewish can be an anti-Zionist, because the very basic idea of being Jewish is to believe we're a people. We're not just a religion. And I think this is what the people that are trying to deny the right of Israel to be a state are people that are trying to say Judaism is a religion, it's not peoplehood. And I don't think there is any Jew that thinks that Judaism is not about peoplehood, about having the right of a nation state. So I kind of asking myself, is there really such a thing as anti-Zionist Judaism? But for me, they're all welcome to my country, to our country, to the state of Israel.
What we'll do now is we're going to draw the evening to a close, and I'm going to have a final question both to Rabbi Jonathan and to the ambassador. And I'm going to ask Rabbi Jonathan first. I think it's fair that we give the ambassador the final word this evening. Rabbi Jonathan, on behalf of the Masorti movement, what is the one or two really important take-home messages that you would like to say to the ambassador and for her to convey to her government?
Thank you. So I'd like to say to you, Your Excellency, that the Anglo-Jewish community as a whole has a very strong relationship with Israel. The distance is not far. Our community have got family, loved ones, children who've served in the IDF in our community. It's deeply alienating for many Jews, though, to feel that the democratic nature and the pluralism, the religious pluralism of the state of Israel is being eroded. So to see a truly democratic, honoring of human rights and the NGOs that support them, pluralist, profoundly Jewish Israel, making the kind of contribution to the world that you spoke of so movingly at the beginning, that's what we would like to see, and that's what we would like to work in partnership with you for.
Thank you.
Ambassador, so you're speaking now to a couple of hundred Masorti Jews. You'll have many opportunity to speak to British Jewry generally, but I'd like you to be specific now with us as a community of liberal, religious, committed Jews, liberal with a small L, part of the Masorti movement. What is your message as the ambassador to the UK and to the Jewish community? What is the message that you would like to share with us specifically?
Well, I think that liberalism in Israel is a way of life. I truly believe in that. Israel is a really progressive country. And many of the things you care about, you can find many Israelis that care about. So maybe what I would like to see is a bridge between communities in Israel that care about ecology, that care about human rights in terms of Ve'ahavta et hager, just like Rabbi Wittenberg said. I think maybe it's more about finding the like-minded communities in Israel that's going to make you feel like you've been represented by the Israeli people as well. This is what I hope. I would like to experience this Green Shabbat that Rabbi Jonathan created. I would like to see more of us like adopting some of the wonderful, wonderful things you're doing here, because I really believe we're one family. So do you think I agree with my four brothers about everything? Believe me, I'm not. They can argue on Shulchan Shabbat in a very loud voice, but we love each other. And each of us thinks he has the full justice, and the other one, sometimes we say to each other, doesn't understand anything. But when it comes to really meeting you, I really believe you have big, big light and a moral voice in this community. And I would like to adopt some of the great ideas that are in your community. And I also would like, maybe this is my last message, please convince the young generation to come and meet the ambassador, because it's not about me, it's about the state of Israel.
Ambassador Hotovely, Rabbi Wittenberg, thank you both very much for an honest, sometimes a little bit difficult, but a really warm and important conversation. We are very happy that you joined us. Very grateful to the Masorti Judaism office team for putting the event together. And I wish everybody a very pleasant evening. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Michael, very much for coordinating this evening.
Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you.
Thank you,
It was
Matt.
a pleasure. Thank you for everyone who joined this evening. Thank you very much.